In the mists of time, when the last echoes of Rome's legions had faded from the cobblestones of Europe, there arose from the ashes of the ancient world a dream that would span 1,000 years. Picture, if you will, the forests of Germania in the deepening twilight of the 8th century, where Celtic druids once walked among sacred oaks and Roman centurions had carved their names into bark that would outlive empires. The wind carries whispers of what was and what might yet be, as if the very air remembers the weight of crowns and the promises made to God and man alike. Here, in this twilight realm between legend and history, began the story of what men would call the Holy Roman Empire. Though it would be neither holy, nor Roman, nor always unified enough to merit the name of empire. Yet, for over a millennium, this extraordinary creation would shape the destiny of Europe, weaving together the threads of Germanic tradition, Christian faith, and the persistent ghost of Roman glory into a tapestry both magnificent and fragile. The tale begins not with conquest or ceremony, but with a man whose very name has become synonymous with greatness, though the path to that greatness wound through valleys of uncertainty and peaks of almost impossible ambition. Charles, whom history would remember as Charlemagne, was born into a world where kingdoms rose and fell with the changing seasons, where loyalty was measured in swords and faith was the only currency that never lost its value. The Frankish kingdom that Charles inherited from his father, Pepin the Short, was already substantial, stretching across much of what we now call France and reaching into the Germanic territories beyond the Rhine. But Charles possessed something that mere inheritance could never provide, a vision that transcended the boundaries of any single realm. He saw in his mind's eye a Christian empire that would unite the quarreling tribes and kingdoms of Europe under one crown, one faith, one law. The year 768 found Charles sharing rule with his brother Charlemagne, an arrangement that pleased neither man nor served the kingdom well. When Charlemagne died suddenly in 771, some whispered of poison, though Charles showed appropriate grief and swiftly assumed sole control of the Frankish domains. Whether by divine providence or earthly calculation, the path to empire was now clear of fraternal obstacles. Charles began his reign as he would continue it, with the cross in one hand and the sword in the other. The Saxon wars that would define much of his early reign began almost immediately as he led his warriors across the Rhine into the dense forests where the Germanic tribes maintained their ancient ways. These were not the swift campaigns of Caesar's Gaul, but a grinding generational struggle that would last over 30 years and test the very foundations of Charles's kingdom. The Saxons, led by chieftains like the formidable Widukind, fought not merely for territory, but for their ancestral gods and ways of life. They knew that Charles brought more than political domination. He brought a new religion that demanded the abandonment of everything their fathers had held sacred. In the deep woods, where Wotan was still honored, and the old stories were told around fires that had burned since time immemorial, resistance took on the character of holy war. Charles's response was systematic and, by the standards of his age, necessary. After each Saxon rebellion, he would rebuild the destroyed churches, re-establish Frankish administration, and transplant populations when needed. When the Saxons destroyed the monastery at Deventer, Charles's retribution was swift and terrible. At Verdun in 782, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon nobles who had broken their oaths of submission. The chroniclers of his court justified this as necessary for the establishment of Christian order, while Saxon bards would remember it as the day the rivers ran red with the blood of heroes. Yet Charles was more than a conqueror. Even as his armies pressed deeper into Saxon territory, he was building something unprecedented, an administrative system that could govern vast territories while respecting local customs and traditions. He established courts that blended Frankish law with local practices, appointed counts who were responsible both to him and to their communities, and created a network of monasteries that served as centers of learning and economic development. The transformation of his realm went beyond mere administration. Charles surrounded himself with scholars from across the known world, creating what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. Alcuin of York brought the scholarly traditions of Anglo-Saxon England to the Frankish court. Theodulf of Orleans contributed his knowledge of classical literature and theology. Paul the Deacon brought the historical wisdom of Lombardy. Together, they worked to preserve and expand human knowledge at a time when much of Europe remained illiterate. The Palace School at Aachen became the intellectual heart of Charles's empire, where young nobles learned not only the arts of war and statecraft, but also Latin grammar, rhetoric, and theology. Charles himself, despite his later reputation for learning, struggled with writing throughout his life, practicing his letters on wax tablets that he kept beneath his pillow. Yet his appreciation for education was genuine and transformative, establishing scriptoriums that would preserve countless classical and Christian texts for future generations. As Charles's power grew, so did his ambitions. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy between 773 and 774 brought him into direct contact with the papacy and the complex politics of the Italian peninsula. When Pope Hadrian IV called for help against the Lombard king Desiderius, Charles saw an opportunity not only to expand his territories, but to position himself as the protector of Christendom itself. The siege of Pavia, the Lombard capital, lasted nearly a year. During this time, Charles made a pilgrimage to Rome, where he was received by the Pope with honors normally reserved for Byzantine emperors. The symbolism was not lost on contemporary observers. Here was a Germanic king being welcomed as the successor to Constantine and Justinian. Charles made generous donations to the church and confirmed the donation of Pepin, which had established papal temporal authority over central Italy. With the fall of Pavia, Charles assumed the Iron Crown of Lombardy, adding King of the Lombards to his growing list of titles. But the Italian campaigns also brought him into conflict with the Byzantine Empire, which still claimed authority over much of southern Italy and Sicily. This tension would persist throughout Charles's reign and beyond, as two empires, each claiming to be the true heir of Rome, faced each other across the Mediterranean. The Spanish campaigns that followed were less successful, but no less significant in shaping Charles's legacy. His expedition across the Pyrenees in 778 was intended to support Muslim allies against the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. But the campaign ended in disaster when his rearguard was ambushed at Roncevaux. Among the dead was Roland, the prefect of the Breton March, whose last stand would inspire one of the greatest epic poems of the medieval period. The Song of Roland, composed perhaps 2 centuries later, transformed a minor military defeat into a stirring tale of Christian heroism against Muslim invasion. In the epic, Roland becomes the perfect Christian knight, dying for his faith and his Lord, rather than sounding his horn for help until it was too late. The poem reflects not so much the historical reality of 778, but the ideals and anxieties of the later medieval period, when the Crusades had made the conflict between Christianity and Islam a defining feature of European consciousness. Yet the failure at Roncevaux did not end Charles's involvement in Spanish affairs. He established the Spanish March, a buffer zone along the Pyrenees that would eventually become the kernel of the kingdoms of Aragon and Catalonia. These frontier territories developed their own distinctive culture, blending Frankish, Visigothic, and Islamic influences in ways that would profoundly shape the later history of the Iberian Peninsula. The eastern campaigns against the Avars proved more conclusively successful. The Avar Khaganate, which had dominated the Pannonian Plain for over 2 centuries, had grown wealthy through tribute, extracted from the Byzantine Empire and control of trade routes linking Europe with Asia. Their ring force, massive circular fortifications that could shelter entire populations, were legendary for their treasures accumulated over generations of conquest and tribute. The destruction of the Avar power between 791 and 803 brought Charles enormous wealth, much of which he distributed to his followers and to churches throughout his realm. More importantly, it opened up the Danube Valley to Frankish settlement and Christianity. The establishment of the Ostmark, the eastern march that would eventually become Austria, created a bridgehead from which German influence would spread deep into Central Europe. Throughout these campaigns, Charles was building more than an empire. He was creating a new model of Christian kingship. Unlike the Byzantine emperors, who ruled as distant autocrats surrounded by elaborate court ceremonial, Charles maintained the Germanic tradition of accessibility. He held court in the open air, listened to petitioners personally, and led his armies in battle well into his 60s. Yet he also adopted Roman and Byzantine symbols of authority, wearing purple robes and using seals that proclaimed his divine mandate to rule. The culmination of Charles's career came on Christmas Day in the year 800, in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. The events of that day have been debated by historians for over 1,000 years, but the essential facts are clear. As Charles knelt in prayer after celebrating Christmas Mass, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head, while the assembled Romans acclaimed him as emperor. Charles's own court chronicler, Einhard, claimed that the king was taken by surprise and would not have entered the church had he known what the Pope intended. This account, written years later, probably reflects Charles's awareness of the diplomatic complications his coronation would create, particularly with the Byzantine Empire, which still considered itself the sole legitimate heir of Rome. The Empress Irene, who ruled in Constantinople, was not likely to welcome a rival claimant to the imperial title. Yet the coronation was almost certainly planned in advance by Charles and the Pope. Leo III had his own reasons for seeking a powerful protector. He had been attacked by rivals in Rome the previous year and had fled to Charles's court for protection. By crowning Charles emperor, Leo established the principle that the Pope had the authority to bestow imperial dignity, while Charles gained the religious legitimacy that his conquests alone could not provide. The immediate reaction to the coronation varied across Europe. The Franks were naturally pleased to see their king elevated to imperial status. The Byzantines were outraged, viewing the coronation as an act of usurpation and refusing to recognize Charles's imperial title for years. The Muslims of Spain and North Africa were largely indifferent, though they noted the increase in Christian prestige that the event represented. More important were the long-term implications of the coronation. It established the principle that there could be an emperor in the West independent of Byzantine authority, while simultaneously creating a complex relationship between imperial and papal power that would define European politics for centuries to come. The question of whether the emperor served the Pope or the Pope served the emperor would provoke countless conflicts and shape the development of both church and state throughout the medieval period. Charles spent the remaining 14 years of his reign consolidating his empire and preparing for its continuation after his death. He issued the Capitulary of 802, which required all his subjects to swear a new oath of loyalty to him as emperor, not merely as king. He standardized weights and measures throughout his territories, established a common currency, and created a network of royal representatives called missi dominici, who traveled throughout the empire, ensuring that royal commands were obeyed and justice was properly administered. The emperor also devoted considerable attention to education and religious reform. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 required all monasteries and cathedral chapters to maintain schools, while the Capitulary de Litteris Colendis emphasized the importance of proper Latin for the understanding of scripture and law. This educational revival had profound consequences for European civilization. preserving classical learning through the Viking raids and political chaos that would follow Charles's death. Religious reform went hand in hand with education. Charles worked closely with learned churchmen like Alcuin to standardize liturgical practices throughout his empire, establish uniform rules for monastic life, and ensure that the clergy were properly educated in their duties. The result was a significant improvement in the quality of religious life and a strengthening of the bonds between church and state that characterized the Carolingian system. Yet even as Charles built his empire, he was acutely aware of its fragility. Germanic tradition dictated that a king's realm should be divided among his sons, but Charles recognized that such division would destroy the unity he had worked so hard to create. Initially, he planned to divide the empire among his three legitimate sons. Charles the Younger would receive the Frankish heartland, Pepin would receive Italy and Bavaria, and Louis would receive Aquitaine and the Spanish March. The deaths of Charles the Younger in 811 and Pepin in 810 simplified the succession question while simultaneously raising it to crisis proportions. Louis the Pious, the sole surviving son, was capable and devout, but lacked his father's charisma and political instincts. Charles spent his final years preparing Louis for the enormous responsibilities of imperial rule, but he could not bequeath the personal authority that had held the diverse peoples of the empire together under his own leadership. Charles died at Aachen on January 28, 814, after a brief illness that contemporary chroniclers attributed to various causes ranging from natural old age to divine judgment. He was buried in the cathedral he'd built at his favorite palace, in a tomb that reflected both his imperial dignity and his Christian faith. The inscription on his tomb proclaimed him Charles the Great and Orthodox Emperor, though history would remember him more simply as Charlemagne, the father of Europe. Louis the Pious inherited an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Baltic, from the Atlantic to the Danube, encompassing perhaps 15 million people speaking dozens of different languages and following countless local customs. The challenge of governing such a vast and diverse realm would have tested even Charlemagne's abilities. For Louis, it proved ultimately impossible. The new emperor began his reign with reforms intended to strengthen imperial authority and improve the moral tone of the court. He dismissed many of his father's advisors, expelled concubines and illegitimate children from the palace, and imposed stricter standards of conduct on the nobility. These reforms, while well-intentioned, alienated many of the powerful families whose support was essential for effective rule. Louis also faced immediate challenges on the empire's frontiers. The Danes, under their energetic king Godfrey, were beginning the raids that would eventually develop into the Great Viking expansion. Slavic tribes were pressing against the empire's eastern borders, while Muslim forces continued to threaten the Spanish March. Each of these challenges required military responses that strained the empire's resources and tested the loyalty of its diverse populations. The most serious challenge to Louis's reign, however, came from within his own family. The birth of his son Charles the Bald in 823 to his second wife Judith upset the succession arrangements he had made earlier for his sons from his first marriage. The Ordinatio Imperii of 817 had designated Lothair as emperor and heir to the imperial title, while giving subordinate kingdoms to Pepin of Aquitaine and Louis the German. The need to provide for Charles the Bald required a revision of these arrangements that satisfied no one and pleased few. The resulting succession crisis led to a series of civil wars that devastated the empire and undermined imperial authority throughout Europe. The wars of the 830s and 840s saw father fighting against sons, brothers against brothers, and nobles changing sides repeatedly as they calculated their best interests. The Battle of Fontenoy in 841, where Lothair fought against his brothers Louis the German and Charles the Bald, was remembered as one of the bloodiest conflicts of the entire medieval period. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 finally ended the civil wars by dividing the empire among Louis's three surviving sons. Charles the Bald, received the western portion, which would eventually become France. Louis the German received the eastern portion, which would become Germany. Lothair retained the imperial title and received the Middle Kingdom, a long, narrow strip of territory stretching from the Low Countries to northern Italy that included the imperial capitals of Aachen and Rome. The division of Charlemagne's empire was more than a political arrangement. It was the beginning of the formation of the modern European state system. The Western Kingdom would develop into France, with its own language, culture, and political traditions. The Eastern Kingdom would become the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, maintaining the imperial tradition while developing distinctively German characteristics. The Middle Kingdom would fragment into numerous smaller states, creating the complex political geography of Italy, Switzerland, and the Low Countries. Yet the imperial tradition did not die with the Treaty of Verdun. Lothair continued to claim authority over his brothers as emperor, though his actual power was limited to his own territories. When he died in 855, the imperial title passed to his son, Louis II, who spent most of his reign fighting Muslims in southern Italy. The imperial crown continued to pass through the Carolingian family, but its authority steadily declined as the great magnates of each kingdom pursued their own interests. The final collapse of effective Carolingian rule came in the late 9th century, as a combination of Viking raids, Magyar invasions, and internal strife reduced the once mighty empire to a collection of warring principalities. The deposition of Charles the Fat in 887 marked the end of any pretense of imperial unity, though various Carolingian descendants continued to claim royal titles in different parts of Europe. The period following the collapse of the Carolingian Empire is often called the Iron Century or the Dark Age, though these terms obscure the significant developments that occurred during this time. Local strongmen built castles and established territorial lordships that provided security in exchange for service and loyalty. The feudal system that emerged from this process was not the product of theoretical planning, but a practical response to the need for protection in an age of constant warfare. The church, too, adapted to the new circumstances. Bishops and abbots became territorial lords in their own right, ruling their lands with the same mixture of spiritual authority and military force that characterized secular lordship. The monastery of Cluny, founded in 910, began a reform movement that would eventually spread throughout Europe, emphasizing religious discipline and independence from secular interference. Yet even in this age of fragmentation, the memory of empire remained strong. Local rulers continued to claim royal titles and to invoke Charlemagne's legacy in support of their ambitions. The imperial ideal survived particularly strongly in the eastern part of the former Carolingian Empire, where the dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia maintained some semblance of unity under the nominal authority of the Carolingian kings. The transformation of this loose confederation into a new empire began with the rise of the Ottonian dynasty in the early 10th century. Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, was elected King of the Germans in 919 after the death of the last Carolingian king in the Eastern Kingdom. Henry was a practical man who focused on defending his realm against Magyar invasions and consolidating royal authority within Germany. Henry's son, Otto inherited both his father's ambitions and his political skills, but he possessed something more, a vision of imperial greatness that rivaled Charlemagne's own. Otto understood that lasting power required more than military success. It required the support of the church, the loyalty of the great nobles, and the legitimacy that came from association with the imperial tradition. Otto's early reign was marked by rebellions from his family members and the great dukes who had elected him king. His brother Henry and his son Ludolf both led revolts against his authority, while the dukes of Bavaria and Swabia repeatedly tested the limits of royal power. Otto's response was typically medieval. He defeated his enemies in battle, forgave them publicly, and then gradually replaced them with more reliable supporters. The Magyar threat that had plagued Germany for decades reached its climax during Otto's reign. These nomadic warriors from the Hungarian plain had conducted devastating raids throughout Europe since the late 9th century, destroying cities, massacring populations, and extracting tribute from rulers who could not defend their territories. Otto recognized that defeating the Magyars required more than defensive measures. It required a decisive battle that would break their power permanently. The Battle of Lechfeld in 955 was one of the most significant military engagements of the medieval period. Otto assembled a coalition army that included not only German warriors, but also Bohemian and other allies, demonstrating his growing authority beyond the borders of Germany proper. The battle itself was fierce and closely contested, but Otto's victory was complete. The Magyar leader was captured and executed, and the survivors fled back to Hungary, never again to threaten Western Europe. The victory at Lechfeld established Otto as the premier ruler in Europe and opened the way for his imperial ambitions. Like Charlemagne before him, Otto understood that the imperial title required papal recognition, and that papal recognition required intervention in Italian politics. The opportunity came when Pope John III, threatened by the growing power of Berengar of Italy, appealed to Otto for protection. Otto's first Italian campaign in 961–962 was a masterpiece of medieval statecraft. He defeated Berengar quickly, established German control over northern Italy, and presented himself in Rome as the protector of the Church and the heir to Charlemagne's legacy. On February 2, 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica, consciously evoking the memory of Charlemagne's coronation 162 years earlier. The restoration of the empire under Otto I marked the beginning of what historians call the Holy Roman Empire, though that specific title would not be used regularly until the 13th century. Otto's empire differed from Charlemagne's in several important ways. It was more specifically German in character, drawing its primary strength from the German duchies rather than from the broader European territories that Charlemagne had ruled. It was also more consciously focused on Italy and the papal relationship, reflecting Otto's understanding that imperial legitimacy required Roman recognition. The Ottonian system that emerged from Otto's reign was based on the alliance between crown and church that would characterize the Holy Roman Empire throughout its history. Otto appointed bishops and abbots to important administrative positions, using their education and their independence from family loyalties to counterbalance the power of the secular nobility. In return, the church received royal protection and generous endowments that made it the wealthiest institution in the empire. This system worked well under strong emperors like Otto I and his immediate successors, but it contained the seeds of future conflicts. The church's wealth and political power inevitably led to corruption and secularization, while the emperor's control over ecclesiastical appointments put him in potential conflict with papal claims to spiritual authority. The investiture controversy that would convulse the empire in the 11th and 12th centuries was already implicit in the Ottonian settlement. Otto I died in 973, after a reign that had restored imperial dignity and established German hegemony in Central Europe. He was succeeded by his son, Otto II, a capable ruler who faced the enormous challenge of maintaining his father's achievements while dealing with new threats on multiple frontiers. The Byzantines were attempting to reassert their authority in southern Italy. The French were testing German strength along the western frontier, and Slavic tribes were pressing against the empire's eastern borders. Otto II's reign was marked by both successes and failures. He successfully defended Germany against French attacks and extended imperial authority deeper into Italy than any ruler since Charlemagne. However, His ambitious attempt to conquer southern Italy from the Byzantines ended in disaster at the Battle of Stilo in 982, where his army was destroyed and he barely escaped with his life. He died suddenly the following year, leaving the empire to his 3-year-old son, Otto III, under the regency of his mother Theophanu, a Byzantine princess. The minority of Otto III was a critical period in the empire's development. Theophanu, despite being a foreign woman in a society that valued neither characteristic in rulers, proved to be an effective regent who maintained imperial authority and prepared her son for his future responsibilities. When Otto III reached maturity, he revealed ambitions that surpassed even those of his predecessors. Otto III dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire in its full glory, with himself ruling from Rome over a restored Christian empire that would unite East and West. He established his court in Rome, adopted Byzantine court ceremonial, and surrounded himself with scholars and advisors from across Europe. His seal proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans, and he issued documents that consciously imitated ancient Roman imperial style. Yet Otto III's Roman dreams were ultimately impractical. The German nobles who provided the foundation of imperial power had little interest in supporting an emperor who spent most of his time in Italy. The Romans themselves were suspicious of German rule and repeatedly revolted against imperial authority. When Otto III died suddenly in 1002 at the age of 21, his ambitious plans died with him. The succession crisis that followed Otto III's death nearly destroyed the Ottonian system. Several candidates claimed the imperial throne, including Henry of Bavaria, who eventually emerged victorious and was crowned as Henry II in 9002. Henry was a very different sort of emperor from his predecessor, focusing on consolidating imperial authority in Germany rather than pursuing grandiose schemes in Italy or elsewhere. Henry II's reign marked a return to the practical policies that had made the Ottonian system successful. He worked closely with the German Church to strengthen royal administration, defended the empire's eastern frontiers against Polish and Hungarian attacks, and intervened in Italy only when necessary to maintain imperial dignity. His canonization as a saint in 1146 reflected the Church's appreciation for his pious support and his respect for ecclesiastical independence. The death of Henry II in 1024 ended the Ottonian dynasty and opened the way for the rise of the Salian emperors. Conrad II, who was elected king by the German nobles, was distantly related to the Ottonians, but represented a new approach to imperial rule. Where the Ottonians had relied primarily on the church and their own family lands for support, Conrad systematically cultivated the lesser nobility and the emerging urban classes. Conrad II's reign was marked by significant territorial expansion and administrative innovation. He inherited the Kingdom of Burgundy through his wife's claims, adding the wealthy territories between the Alps and the Rhone to the empire. He also intervened decisively in Poland and Hungary, establishing imperial suzerainty over both kingdoms and extending German influence deep into Eastern Europe. More importantly, Conrad began the process of transforming the Holy Roman Empire from a personal monarchy into an institutional state. He issued the Constitutio de Foedis in 1037, which established hereditary rights for lesser nobles and created a system of vassalage that provided military service in exchange for land tenure. This feudal system gave the empire a more stable foundation than the personal loyalties that had supported previous emperors. Conrad's son Henry III inherited an empire at the height of its power and prestige. The German kingdom was secure, Italy was peaceful under imperial rule, and the church was firmly under imperial control. Henry used this strength to pursue ambitious reforms intended to purify the church and strengthen the bonds between spiritual and temporal authority. Henry III's intervention in papal politics was unprecedented in its scope and effectiveness. When he arrived in Italy in 1046, he found 3 different men claiming to be pope, each supported by different Roman factions. Henry deposed all 3 claimants and appointed his own candidate, Clement II, who promptly crowned him emperor. Over the next few years, Henry appointed 3 more popes, all German bishops, who shared his vision of church reform. The Salian system of imperial papal cooperation reached its peak under Henry III, but it also created the conditions for its own destruction. The reformed papacy that Henry promoted inevitably began to assert its independence from imperial control. The College of Cardinals, established to ensure that future popes would be selected by the Church rather than by secular rulers, became a vehicle for papal independence. The monastic reform movement, which Henry supported enthusiastically, emphasized spiritual authority over temporal power. These tensions remained largely dormant during Henry III's lifetime, but they exploded into open conflict after his death in 1056. His son Henry IV was only 6 years old when he inherited the imperial crown, and the long regency that followed allowed the reformed papacy to consolidate its independence and prepare for confrontation with imperial authority. The investiture controversy that began in the 1070s was more than a dispute over the appointment of bishops and abbots. It was a fundamental conflict over the nature of authority in Christian society. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, claimed that the Pope had the right to depose emperors and that no lay ruler could appoint ecclesiastical officials. Henry IV, supported by the German bishops who owed their positions to imperial appointment, rejected these claims and declared Gregory deposed. Gregory's response was to excommunicate Henry and release all his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. The political consequences were immediate and devastating. The German nobles, many of whom had their own grievances against imperial authority, used the papal excommunication as justification for rebellion. By early 1077, Henry faced the prospect of deposition by his own nobles unless he could obtain papal forgiveness. The emperor's journey to Canossa in January 1077 was one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history. Henry crossed the Alps in winter, a dangerous and difficult journey that demonstrated the seriousness of his situation. At the castle of Canossa, where Gregory was staying as the guest of Margrave Matilda of Tuscany, Henry stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days before the Pope agreed to receive him. The penance at Canossa was a masterpiece of medieval political theatre. Gregory, as a priest, could not refuse absolution to a penitent sinner, so he was forced to lift the excommunication. Henry, meanwhile, had demonstrated his Christian humility while simultaneously forcing the Pope to restore him to communion. The immediate political crisis was resolved, but the underlying conflict between imperial and papal authority remained unresolved. The investiture controversy continued for another 45 years, involving not only Henry IV and Gregory VII, but their successors as well. The conflict devastated Germany, as imperial and papal supporters fought a series of civil wars that weakened the monarchy and strengthened the territorial princes. The compromise reached in the Concordat of Worms in 1122 established the principle that the Church would control spiritual appointments while the emperor retained significant influence over temporal aspects of ecclesiastical office. The long-term consequences of the investiture controversy were profound. The German monarchy, which had been the strongest in Europe under the Ottonians and early Salians, was permanently weakened by decades of civil war. The territorial princes gained power and independence that they would never surrender, creating the fragmented political structure that would characterize Germany for centuries. The papacy, meanwhile, established its independence from secular control and began to develop the legal and administrative apparatus that would make it a major political force in medieval Europe. The end of the Salian dynasty with the death of Henry V in 1125 opened a new phase in the empire's development. The German nobles, assertive after decades of civil war, rejected Henry's chosen successor and instead elected Lothair of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony. Lothair's reign was brief but significant, as he worked to restore imperial authority in Germany and Italy, while maintaining the church-state settlement reached at Worms. The real transformation of the empire came with the election of Conrad III in 1138, the first member of the Hohenstaufen dynasty to wear the imperial crown. The Hohenstaufens brought new energy and ambition to imperial rule, but they also faced challenges that their predecessors had not encountered. The rise of powerful territorial princes in Germany, the growing independence of Italian city-states, and the increasing assertiveness of the papacy all constrained imperial authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under the Ottonians. Conrad III spent much of his reign fighting civil wars against the Welfs, a powerful noble family that controlled extensive territories in Bavaria and Saxony. This conflict, which would continue intermittently for decades, reflected the broader struggle between imperial authority and territorial independence that characterized the later medieval empire. Conrad's participation in the Second Crusade, while personally pious and politically popular, diverted resources from these internal conflicts without achieving any lasting success in the Holy Land. The true architect of Hohenstaufen greatness was Frederick I, known to history as Frederick Barbarossa, who was elected emperor in 1152. Frederick possessed the political skills, military abilities, and imperial vision necessary to restore the empire to its former glory. He also inherited a more realistic understanding of the empire's limitations and the need to balance conflicting interests rather than simply impose imperial will. Frederick's approach to imperial rule was based on the concept of honor imperii, the honor of the empire, which required that imperial dignity be maintained even when practical power was limited. He understood that the empire's strength lay not in centralized administration, but in the complex web of personal relationships, legal traditions, and mutual obligations that bound together its diverse territories and populations. The early years of Frederick's reign were devoted to restoring peace in Germany and establishing his authority over the territorial princes. The Treaty of Constance in 1153 with Pope Eugene III promised papal support for Frederick's imperial coronation in exchange for protection of church interests and opposition to the Byzantine Empire. This agreement demonstrated Frederick's skill in managing the complex relationship between imperial and papal authority that had caused so much trouble for his predecessors. Frederick's first Italian campaign in 1154-1155 was a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy and warfare. He defeated the Romans who had established a commune independent of papal authority, received the imperial crown from Pope Adrian IV, and established his authority over northern Italy without provoking the massive resistance that earlier imperial interventions had encountered. The success of this campaign established Frederick as the premier ruler in Europe and demonstrated the continued vitality of the imperial ideal. Yet Frederick's greatest challenges lay ahead. The Italian city-states, enriched by Mediterranean commerce and strengthened by their own military innovations, were not prepared to accept the level of imperial control that Frederick deemed necessary for the honor of the empire. The Lombard League, formed in 1167, united most of the northern Italian cities in opposition to imperial authority and created a military alliance that could challenge even Frederick's formidable army. The conflict between Frederick and the Lombard League was more than a political struggle. It represented the clash between two different concepts of government and society. Frederick represented the traditional medieval ideal of hierarchical authority flowing downward from God through the emperor to lesser rulers and finally to the common people. The Italian cities represented a newer model based on communal self-government, commercial enterprise, and citizen militias. The Battle of Legnano in 1176 was the decisive engagement of this conflict. Frederick's army, composed primarily of German knights fighting in the traditional manner, was defeated by the Lombard League's innovative combination of infantry crossbowmen, and cavalry. The emperor himself was nearly captured and was reported dead, though he managed to escape and eventually return to Germany. Legnano marked the beginning of a new phase in imperial policy toward Italy. Frederick recognized that he could not simply impose his will on the Italian cities through military force. He would have to negotiate and compromise. The Peace of Constance in 1183 granted the Lombard cities considerable autonomy in exchange for their recognition of imperial sovereignty and their agreement to provide military service when required. This compromise solution became the model for Frederick's approach to governance throughout the empire. Rather than attempting to centralize authority, he worked within existing structures to establish imperial rights and prerogatives. The result was a complex system of overlapping jurisdictions and mutual obligations that provided stability while preserving local autonomy. Frederick's later years were marked by participation in the Third Crusade, where he died while crossing a river in Anatolia in 1190. His death was mourned throughout Europe, and legends immediately began to grow around his memory. Germans told stories of Frederick sleeping in a mountain cave, waiting to return when his empire needed him most. These legends reflected the popular understanding that Frederick's death marked the end of an era in imperial history. The succession of Frederick's son Henry VI in 1190 brought new opportunities and new challenges to the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Through his marriage to Constance of Sicily, Henry had claims to the wealthy kingdom that controlled southern Italy and Sicily. The conquest of this kingdom would give the empire control over the central Mediterranean and provide the resources necessary to restore imperial authority throughout Europe. Henry VI's Sicilian campaign was swift and successful. The death of King William II in 1189 had left the kingdom in dispute, and Henry was able to defeat his rivals and establish Hohenstaufen rule over Sicily by 1194. The wealth of Sicily derived from its position as a crossroads of Mediterranean trade, and its sophisticated administrative system inherited from its Norman and Arab rulers, transformed the empire's financial position and opened new possibilities for imperial policy. Yet Henry's triumph in Sicily also created new problems. The papacy, which had supported Hohenstaufen claims to the imperial throne, was alarmed by the prospect of being surrounded by imperial territories. The French monarchy, which had emerged as a major rival to imperial power, began to form coalitions against Hohenstaufen hegemony. Most importantly, Henry's German nobles were suspicious of their emperor's focus on southern Italy and concerned that imperial resources were being diverted from German interests. Henry's sudden death in 1197, at the age of 32, precipitated a succession crisis that nearly destroyed the Hohenstaufen dynasty. His son Frederick was only 3 years old and living in Sicily under the protection of Pope Innocent III. The German nobles, faced with the prospect of another long minority, split into competing factions supporting different candidates for the imperial throne. The civil war that followed Henry VI's death lasted for nearly 2 decades and devastated the empire. Philip of Swabia, Frederick's uncle, claimed the throne as the legitimate Hohenstaufen heir. Otto of Brunswick, supported by the Welfs and backed by English money, claimed the throne as the rightful emperor, elected by the German princes. Each candidate had papal support at different times, as Pope Innocent III skillfully played the rivals against each other to advance papal interests in Germany and Italy. The murder of Philip of Swabia in 1208 simplified the succession question without resolving the underlying conflicts. Otto IV was crowned emperor in 1209, but his attempt to conquer Sicily brought him into conflict with Pope Innocent III, who excommunicated him and began supporting the young Frederick of Sicily as a rival candidate. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214, where Otto's ally, King John of England, was defeated by Philip Augustus of France, marked the effective end of Otto's imperial ambitions. Frederick II, who had been crowned King of the Germans in 1212 at the age of 18, was one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval period. Raised in the cosmopolitan court of Sicily, Educated by Arabic and Greek tutors as well as Latin scholars, and exposed from childhood to the complex realities of Mediterranean politics, Frederick brought to the imperial throne a breadth of knowledge and sophistication that none of his predecessors had possessed. The young emperor's first challenge was to establish his authority in Germany, where he had never lived, and where the long civil war had strengthened territorial princes at the expense of royal power. Frederick's solution was characteristically innovative. Rather than attempting to restore the centralized monarchy of his predecessors, he accepted the princes' autonomy in Germany in exchange for their support for his ambitions in Italy and Sicily. The Golden Bull of Eger in 1213 and the Privilege of Speyer in 1214 granted unprecedented rights to the German princes, including the right to fortify their territories, coin money, and exercise complete judicial authority over their subjects. These concessions, which Frederick's predecessors would have considered unthinkable, reflected his realistic assessment of political possibilities and his strategic focus on Sicily and Italy. Frederick's coronation as emperor in 1220 was accompanied by promises to Pope Honorius III that he would separate the kingdoms of Sicily and Germany and would lead a crusade to the Holy Land. These promises, which Frederick had no intention of keeping, reflected his understanding that papal support was essential for his imperial ambitions. The complex relationship between Frederick and the papacy would dominate European politics for the next 30 years. The consolidation of Frederick's authority in Sicily was one of the great administrative achievements of the medieval period. The constitutions of Melfi, issued in 1231, created a centralized state that was centuries ahead of its time in terms of bureaucratic efficiency and legal sophistication. Frederick established a professional civil service recruited through examinations, created a uniform legal code that applied throughout the kingdom, and built a network of castles and fortified cities that made Sicily virtually impregnable. The cultural achievements of Frederick's Sicilian court were equally remarkable. The emperor patronized scholars, poets, and artists from across the Mediterranean world, creating a cosmopolitan cultural environment that synthesized Arabic, Greek, Latin, and vernacular traditions. Frederick himself was a polyglot who spoke 9 languages and wrote poetry in both Latin and Italian. His court became known as the wonder of the world, a center of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled the greatest courts of the ancient world. Yet Frederick's greatest achievements were also the source of his greatest conflicts. The creation of a powerful, centralized state in Sicily alarmed the papacy, which saw its own temporal authority threatened by imperial expansion. The emperor's tolerance for Muslims and his use of Muslim soldiers in his armies scandalized contemporary Christians. Most problematically, his obvious preference for Sicily over Germany undermined his authority north of the Alps and provided his enemies with powerful propaganda weapons. The conflict between Frederick and Pope Gregory IX, which began in the 1220s, was one of the defining struggles of the medieval period. Gregory accused Frederick of heresy, citing his tolerance for Muslims, his interest in Arabic philosophy, and his failure to fulfill his crusading vows. Frederick responded by arguing that the Pope had exceeded his spiritual authority and was interfering in temporal matters that belonged to the emperor alone. The emperor's crusade to the Holy Land in 1228–1229 was characteristic of his unconventional approach to medieval problems. Rather than leading a military campaign, Frederick negotiated a treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil that restored Jerusalem to Christian control for 10 years. This diplomatic success, achieved without bloodshed, was denounced by the Pope as an unholy alliance with infidels and used as further evidence of Frederick's heretical tendencies. Frederick's return to Italy in 1229 marked the beginning of his final struggle with the papacy. Pope Gregory IX had invaded Sicily during the emperor's absence, and Frederick's response was swift and decisive. His armies quickly expelled papal forces from imperial territories, and he began preparing for a march on Rome itself. Only Gregory's death in 1241 prevented a direct confrontation that might have resulted in the capture of the Pope. The election of Pope Innocent IV in 1243 initially seemed to offer hope for reconciliation between empire and papacy. Innocent was a skilled lawyer and diplomat who understood the complexity of the issues dividing the two powers. However, his fundamental commitment to papal supremacy made compromise impossible, and the conflict resumed with even greater intensity. The Council of Lyon in 1245, where Pope Innocent IV formally deposed Frederick II, marked the climax of the medieval struggle between spiritual and temporal authority. The Pope's deposition decree listed Frederick's alleged crimes: failure to fulfill his crusading vows, alliance with Muslims, persecution of the Church, and suspected heresy. Frederick's supporters argued that no earthly power could depose an emperor who held his authority directly from God, but the propaganda war was clearly being won by the papacy. Frederick's final years were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his authority in the face of papal opposition and princely rebellion. The formation of the First League of Lyon in 1245 united the Pope's supporters across Europe in opposition to imperial authority. In Germany, the princes elected an anti-emperor, while in Italy, the cities of the Lombard League resumed their resistance to imperial control. The emperor's death in 1250, at the age of 55, came at a moment when his position seemed hopeless, but not yet lost. Frederick had retained the loyalty of his Sicilian subjects and still commanded significant military resources. His intellectual curiosity remained undimmed, and he continued to work on his famous treatise on falconry, the art of hunting with birds, until shortly before his death. Frederick II's legacy was complex and contradictory. His creation of a modern state in Sicily demonstrated the possibility of effective centralized government, but his conflicts with the papacy and the German princes weakened the empire as a whole. His cosmopolitan culture and intellectual achievements earned him the title Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. But his reputation for impiety damaged imperial prestige throughout Christian Europe. The succession crisis that followed Frederick's death marked the beginning of what historians call the Great Interregnum, a period of nearly 2 decades when the imperial throne was either vacant or occupied by weak rulers who lacked the resources to exercise effective authority. Frederick's son, Conrad IV, briefly held the throne, but his death in 1254 left the empire without a generally recognized emperor for the first time since the 10th century. The collapse of Hohenstaufen power had profound consequences for European politics. In Germany, the territorial princes consolidated their independence and began to act as sovereign rulers within their own territories. The emergence of the electoral system, formalized in the Golden Bull of 1356, reflected the reality that the emperor's authority now depended entirely on the support of a small number of powerful princes. In Italy, the absence of imperial authority allowed the city-states to develop their own forms of government and to expand their territories at the expense of their neighbors. The maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa built commercial empires that stretched across the Mediterranean. Florence, Milan, and other inland cities began the territorial expansion that would eventually create the regional states of Renaissance Italy. The election of Rudolf of Habsburg as emperor in 1273 ended the Great Interregnum, but did not restore imperial authority to its former level. Rudolf was chosen precisely because he was not powerful enough to threaten the prince's independence. His reign was spent largely in establishing his family's control over Austria and other territories in the eastern part of the empire, creating the foundation for future Habsburg greatness. The Habsburg dynasty that emerged from Rudolf's reign would eventually become one of the most powerful in European history, but their approach to imperial rule was fundamentally different from that of their predecessors. Where the Salians and Hohenstaufens had tried to create centralized monarchies, the Habsburgs built their power through dynastic marriages, territorial acquisitions, and careful management of their diverse holdings. The 14th century was a period of profound transformation for the Holy Roman Empire. The Black Death, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed perhaps 1/3 of the population and disrupted the economic and social structures that had supported medieval civilization. The papal schism that began in 1378 divided the church and undermined the spiritual authority that had been central to medieval political theory. These crises created opportunities as well as challenges for imperial authority. The Golden Bull issued by Emperor Charles IV in 1356 established a constitutional framework for the empire that would endure until its dissolution in 1806. The bull identified 7 electors who would choose the emperor: the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Charles IV's reign from 1355 to 1378 represented a different model of imperial success. Rather than attempting to dominate Italy or restore centralized authority in Germany, Charles focused on building up his own kingdom of Bohemia and using imperial dignity to advance his family's interests. Prague became one of the most magnificent cities in Europe, with a university, cathedral, and royal palace that rivaled those of Paris or London. The Luxembourg dynasty's approach to imperial rule emphasized the symbolic and ceremonial aspects of imperial dignity rather than its practical exercise. Charles IV understood that the empire's value lay not in its ability to command obedience, but in its capacity to confer legitimacy and status on those who possessed it. This insight would guide imperial policy for centuries to come. The election of Sigismund of Luxembourg in 1410 brought to the imperial throne a ruler who faced some of the most serious challenges in the empire's history. The papal schism had divided the church into competing factions, each claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter. The Hussite Revolution in Bohemia challenged both royal authority and Catholic orthodoxy. The Ottoman Empire was expanding into the Balkans, threatening the very existence of Christian Europe. Sigismund's response to these challenges demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of imperial authority in the later medieval period. The Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418 under imperial sponsorship, successfully ended the papal schism and restored unity to the church. However, Sigismund's promise of safe conduct to the Bohemian reformer Jan Hus was violated when the council condemned Hus as a heretic and burned him at the stake. The resulting Hussite wars devastated Bohemia and demonstrated the empire's inability to suppress religious dissent through military force alone. The Hussites' innovative military tactics, including the use of war wagons and early firearms, repeatedly defeated imperial armies and established the principle that religious minorities could maintain their independence through armed resistance. Sigismund's campaigns against the Ottoman Empire were similarly unsuccessful. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, where a European crusading army was destroyed by Ottoman forces, marked the end of effective Christian resistance to Turkish expansion in the Balkans. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 eliminated the Byzantine Empire and established the Ottomans as a major threat to the Habsburg territories in Hungary and Austria. The election of Frederick III of Habsburg in 1440 began the period of Habsburg dominance that would continue until the empire's end. Frederick's reign of 53 years was the longest in imperial history, but it was marked more by survival than by achievement. He lost control of Hungary to the Ottomans, saw his authority in Germany challenged by powerful princes, and spent much of his reign in exile from his own hereditary territories. Yet Frederick's patient diplomacy and strategic marriages laid the foundation for Habsburg greatness. His acquisition of the Netherlands through marriage created a power base that would eventually span Europe. His motto, Austria est imperare orbi universo, Austria is destined to rule the world, reflected his confidence in his dynasty's ultimate destiny, despite the immediate challenges it faced. The transformation of the empire accelerated under Frederick's son, Maximilian I, who reigned from 1493 to 1519. Maximilian was a Renaissance prince who combined medieval chivalric ideals with innovative military and administrative techniques. His marriage to Mary of Burgundy brought the wealthy Netherlands under Habsburg control, while his diplomatic efforts prepared the way for his grandson's acquisition of the Spanish throne. Maximilian's military reforms modernized the imperial army and created the foundation for Habsburg military dominance in the 16th century. The establishment of the Landsknechts, professional German infantry armed with pikes and early firearms, gave the empire a military capability that could compete with the Swiss and the emerging nation-states of Western Europe. The cultural achievements of Maximilian's reign were equally significant. The emperor patronized artists like Albrecht Dürer and composers like Heinrich Isaac, creating a distinctively German Renaissance culture that rivaled the achievements of Italy and France. His autobiography, Weisskönig, was one of the first works to present a ruler's life in terms of personal achievement rather than divine mandate. Yet perhaps Maximilian's greatest achievement was his recognition that the empire's future lay not in Germany or Italy, but in the broader European balance of power. His dynastic policies created a Habsburg empire that would dominate European politics for the next 2 centuries, while his administrative reforms provided the institutional framework that would allow the Holy Roman Empire to survive the religious and political upheavals of the early modern period. The election of Charles V in 1519 brought to the imperial throne a ruler whose dominions exceeded even those of Charlemagne. Through inheritance from his 4 grandparents, Charles controlled Spain and its American colonies, the Netherlands, Austria, Bohemia, parts of Italy, and the traditional German territories of the empire. For the first time since the 8th century, a single ruler controlled territories that truly deserved the name of empire. Yet Charles's vast dominions also created unprecedented challenges. The Protestant Reformation, which began with Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517, divided the empire along religious lines and created conflicts that would plague European politics for centuries. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent threatened Habsburg territories in Hungary and Austria, while tying down military resources needed elsewhere. The French monarchy, under Francis I and his successors, was determined to prevent Habsburg hegemony in Europe and fought a series of wars that lasted for most of Charles's reign. The emergence of England as a naval power under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I created new complications in the Netherlands and the Atlantic world. The discovery and conquest of the Americas provided enormous wealth, but also created new responsibilities and conflicts. Charles's response to these challenges was characteristically Habsburg: patient diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the careful management of competing interests. The religious peace of Augsburg in 1555 established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, allowing German princes to determine the religion of their territories. This compromise preserved the unity of the empire while acknowledging the reality of religious division. The emperor's abdication in 1556 was one of the most dramatic events of the 16th century. Charles divided his enormous inheritance between his son Philip, who received Spain and its dependencies, and his brother Ferdinand, who received the German territories and the imperial title. This division reflected Charles's recognition that his empire had become too large and complex for effective rule by a single person. Ferdinand I's reign from 1558 to 1564 established the pattern of Habsburg imperial rule that would continue for the next 2.5 centuries. The emperor's primary focus was on defending the empire's eastern frontiers against Ottoman expansion, while maintaining the religious settlement reached at Augsburg. The complex federal structure that emerged from this period balanced imperial authority with territorial autonomy in ways that allowed both to coexist. The Long Turkish War that lasted from 1593 to 1606 was one of the most significant conflicts of Ferdinand's reign. The Habsburg victory at the Battle of Kerestes in 1596 marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's gradual retreat from Central Europe, though the Turks would remain a major threat for another century. The Peace of Zitvatarok in 1606 established a stable frontier between the two empires and allowed both to focus on internal development. The religious conflicts that had been temporarily resolved at Augsburg resumed with increasing intensity during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, led by the Jesuit order and supported by Habsburg emperors, sought to restore Catholic unity throughout the empire. Protestant princes responded by forming defensive alliances and seeking support from foreign powers. The election of Ferdinand II in 1619 brought to the imperial throne a ruler whose commitment to Catholic restoration was absolute. Ferdinand's attempt to impose Catholic conformity on his hereditary territories triggered the Bohemian Revolt of 1618, which quickly escalated into the 30 Years' War, the most devastating conflict in European history before the 20th century. The 30 Years' War was fought on multiple levels: as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, as a constitutional struggle between imperial authority and territorial independence, and as an international war involving all the major European powers. The war's complexity defies simple explanation, but its consequences for the Holy Roman Empire were profound and lasting. The early phases of the war saw significant Catholic and imperial victories. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 crushed Bohemian independence and established Habsburg control over the kingdom. The victories of Catholic forces under generals like Tilly and Wallenstein seemed to promise the restoration of imperial authority throughout Germany and the triumph of the Counter-Reformation. Yet the intervention of foreign powers gradually turned the tide against the emperor. The entry of Sweden under Gustavus Adolphus in 1630 provided Protestant forces with military leadership and financial resources that they had previously lacked. The French declaration of war in 1635 opened a second front that stretched imperial resources beyond their limits. The devastation caused by the war was unprecedented in European history. Contemporary estimates suggest that the population of Germany declined by perhaps 30%, with some regions losing more than half their inhabitants to warfare, disease, and famine. Cities were destroyed, trade routes were disrupted, and the economic and social structures that had supported medieval civilization were shattered. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, ended the 30 Years' War, but permanently altered the constitution of the Holy Roman Empire. The treaty granted territorial princes the right to make treaties with foreign powers, effectively ending imperial control over foreign policy. The principle of religious freedom was extended to include Calvinism as well as Catholicism and Lutheranism, while the emperor's authority to intervene in territorial affairs was severely restricted. The Westphalian settlement created what historians call the Old Empire, a loose confederation of over 300 sovereign territories united only by their common allegiance to the emperor. This system, while politically weak, proved remarkably durable and provided the framework for German political development until the Napoleonic era. The reign of Leopold V from 1658 to 1705 demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of imperial authority under the Westphalian system. Leopold successfully defended Vienna against Ottoman siege in 1683, beginning the reconquest of Hungary that would make Austria a major European power. His participation in the War of the Spanish Succession established Habsburg claims to European leadership while confirming the empire's role as a balancer in European politics. Yet, Leopold's reign also revealed the empire's fundamental weaknesses. The Great Turkish War that lasted from 1683 to 1699 was won primarily by Austrian rather than imperial forces, reflecting the reality that the emperor's power now depended more on his hereditary territories than on his imperial authority. The rise of Prussia under Frederick William, the Great Elector, created a rival within the empire that would eventually challenge Habsburg hegemony. The 18th century was marked by the gradual transformation of the Holy Roman Empire from a medieval confederation into a modern state system. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, demonstrated that the empire could no longer function as a unified military force. The rise of Prussia under Frederick the Great created a dualistic system in which Habsburg Austria and Hohenzollern-Prussia competed for leadership within the German-speaking world. The reign of Joseph II, from 1765 to 1790, represented the last serious attempt to transform the Holy Roman Empire into a modern centralized state. Joseph's reforms, inspired by Enlightenment principles, sought to create a rational, efficient administration that would serve the common good rather than traditional privileges. His Edict of Toleration granted religious freedom to Protestants and Jews, while his abolition of serfdom promised to modernize the empire's social structure. Yet Joseph's reforms encountered massive resistance from the privileged classes whose positions they threatened. The nobility, the church, and the territorial princes all opposed changes that would reduce their traditional authority. The outbreak of revolution in France in 1789 provided additional arguments against reform, as conservatives argued that change would lead to chaos and destruction. The French Revolutionary Wars that began in 1792 posed an existential threat to the Holy Roman Empire. The revolutionary government's declaration of war on Austria in 1792 was followed by French invasion of the Rhineland and the Netherlands. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 horrified European conservatives and created a coalition dedicated to destroying the revolutionary regime. Yet the empire's response to the French threat revealed its fundamental weakness. The individual territories pursued their own interests rather than coordinating imperial policy. Prussia made a separate peace with France in 1795, leaving Austria to fight alone. The smaller German states proved incapable of effective resistance and were systematically conquered or coerced into alliance with France. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte transformed the French threat from revolutionary chaos into imperial ambition. Napoleon's victories at Austerlitz in 1805 and Jena Auerstedt in 1806 demonstrated the military superiority of the French system and the obsolescence of the old imperial structure. The creation of the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806 provided Napoleon with German allies and made the Holy Roman Empire irrelevant to German politics. Francis II's decision to abdicate the imperial title on August 6, 1806, marked the end of the Holy Roman Empire after more than 1,000 years of existence. The emperor's proclamation stated that the empire could no longer fulfill its constitutional functions, and that continued existence would only create confusion and conflict. The dissolution was accomplished without violence or ceremony, reflecting the empire's gradual decline rather than dramatic collapse. The end of the Holy Roman Empire was mourned by romantics and conservatives, but welcomed by reformers and nationalists who saw it as an obstacle to German unity and modernization. The Napoleonic reorganization of Germany reduced the number of German states from over 300 to fewer than 40, creating larger, more viable political units that could better serve their population's needs. Yet the empire's legacy was more complex than either its critics or its defenders recognized. The constitutional principles developed over centuries of imperial history provided models for federal government that would influence the development of modern democratic states. The empire's protection of religious minorities and small territories created a tradition of tolerance and diversity that enriched German culture and politics. The Holy Roman Empire's influence on European law, culture, and politics continued long after its formal dissolution. The concept of a supranational authority that could balance competing national interests while preserving local autonomy would inspire both the German Confederation and the European Union. The empire's complex constitutional structure provided precedents for federal systems of government from the United States to modern Germany. In the final analysis, the Holy Roman Empire succeeded not because it was strong, but because it was adaptable. Its ability to evolve from Charlemagne's personal monarchy to the complex federal system of the 18th century demonstrated a flexibility that few political institutions have matched. The empire survived the investiture controversy, the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, and countless other crises because it was able to balance competing interests and accommodate change while maintaining essential continuities. The years leading to the empire's final dissolution were filled with both desperate attempts at revival and quiet acceptance of inevitable change. The Congress of Rastatt, which met from 1797 to 1799, had already begun the process of territorial reorganization that would culminate in the empire's end. The smaller ecclesiastical states, which had been pillars of the old imperial structure, were gradually secularized and absorbed by larger neighbors. Ancient monasteries that had preserved learning through centuries of upheaval found their libraries scattered and their communities dissolved. In the shadows of these great political transformations, individual lives continued their quiet courses. The last imperial knights, those proud guardians of medieval tradition, watched as their ancient privileges were swept away by the demands of modern warfare and administration. Village priests in remote valleys celebrated Mass in Latin, while French armies marched past their churches. Merchants in the free cities adapted their trade routes to accommodate new political boundaries, while preserving the commercial networks that had enriched the empire for centuries. The mental world of the empire's final generation was shaped by competing visions of past and future. Enlightenment philosophers like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe witnessed the empire's end with mixed feelings, recognizing both the necessity of change and the loss of something irreplaceable. Conservative thinkers like Edmund Burke, writing from England, mourned the destruction of ancient institutions that had embodied centuries of human wisdom and experience. The Romantic movement that emerged in these years was deeply influenced by nostalgia for the medieval empire. Poets and artists began to reimagine the Middle Ages as a time of heroism, spirituality, and organic unity, in contrast to the rationalism and materialism of their own era. The Brothers Grimm collected folk tales that preserved memories of emperors and knights, while architects began to revive Gothic styles that evoked the empire's medieval grandeur. Yet even as the old empire died, new forms of German unity were being born. The Confederation of the Rhine, created by Napoleon in 1806, demonstrated that German states could cooperate effectively when freed from the constraints of ancient constitutional forms. The wars of liberation that began in 1813 awakened a sense of German nationalism that transcended the boundaries of individual territories and pointed toward future unification. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations, marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall and the restoration of German independence. The coalition forces that defeated Napoleon included not only Prussians and Austrians, but also soldiers from the smaller German states who fought for their homeland rather than for their particular princes. This experience of common struggle created bonds that would influence German political development for decades to come. The Congress of Vienna, which met from 1814 to 1815, faced the enormous task of reconstructing European order after the Napoleonic upheaval. The diplomats who gathered in the Austrian capital were acutely aware that they were designing not only a new balance of power, but also new forms of political organization that would replace the institutions destroyed by 25 years of revolution and war. Prince Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister who dominated the Congress, was deeply influenced by his understanding of the old empire's federal structure. The German Confederation that emerged from the Congress's deliberations was consciously modelled on the Holy Roman Empire's later constitutional development. Like the old empire, the Confederation balanced the authority of a central institution with the sovereignty of member states, creating a framework for cooperation without sacrificing local autonomy. The Confederation's Federal Diet, which met in Frankfurt, occupied the same building where Holy Roman emperors had once been elected. This symbolic continuity was not accidental. The diplomats at Vienna understood that successful institutions must build on existing traditions rather than attempting to create entirely new forms of government. The Diet's procedures, the ranking of member states, and even the ceremonial aspects of Confederate governance all echoed imperial precedents. Yet the German Confederation was also profoundly different from the Holy Roman Empire. Where the empire had been held together by personal loyalties and religious bonds, the Confederation was based on treaties and mutual interests. Where the empire had claimed universal authority, the Confederation was explicitly limited to German affairs. Where the empire had been sacred as well as political, the Confederation was purely secular in its foundations and aspirations. The cultural legacy of the Holy Roman Empire continued to influence German development throughout the 19th century. The University of Berlin, founded in 1810, became a center for the scholarly study of German history and law. Historians like Leopold von Ranke began to develop new methods for understanding the medieval past, while legal scholars worked to codify the complex traditions that had governed the empire's final centuries. The Prussian legal reforms of this period drew heavily on imperial precedents. The Prussian Civil Code, which served as a model for legal development throughout Germany, incorporated principles of local autonomy and federal authority that had been central to the empire's constitutional structure. The concept of the Rechtsstaat, the state governed by law, reflected imperial traditions of constitutional limitation on arbitrary power. The economic development of 19th century Germany also built on imperial foundations. The customs union established by Prussia in 1818 gradually expanded to include most German states, creating a common market that recalled the empire's medieval trade networks. The removal of internal tariffs and the standardization of weights and measures echoed reforms that emperors had attempted throughout the empire's history. Railroad construction in the 1830s and 1840s followed routes that had been established during the imperial period. The great commercial cities of the Rhineland and northern Germany recovered their prosperity as transportation improvements made their traditional advantages relevant to industrial development. Hamburg and Bremen, the last survivors of the medieval Hanseatic League, became major ports for German overseas trade. The Revolution of 1848 represented both the culmination of imperial traditions and their final transformation into modern nationalism. The Frankfurt Parliament that met in the Paulskirche consciously evoked memories of the imperial diet while attempting to create a unified German nation-state. The Parliament's debates over the boundaries of a future Germany reflected competing interpretations of the empire's historical legacy. The Parliament's offer of the imperial crown to Frederick William IV of Prussia symbolized the tension between old and new forms of German unity. Frederick William's rejection of what he called a crown from the gutter reflected his attachment to traditional legitimacy, but it also demonstrated the impossibility of reviving imperial institutions in their medieval form. The failure of the Frankfurt Parliament marked the end of attempts to create German unity through constitutional means and pointed toward the Prussian solution that would eventually succeed, The question of Austria's place in a unified Germany was particularly complex because of the empire's historical legacy. Austria had been the empire's heart for over 4 centuries, and Austrian Germans considered themselves the natural leaders of the German-speaking world. Yet Austria's multinational character made it impossible to integrate into a German nation-state without creating enormous complications for the empire's non-German populations. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 settled this question through military means. Prussia's victory at Königgrätz excluded Austria from German affairs and cleared the way for Prussian leadership of a smaller but more unified Germany. The dissolution of the German Confederation after the war marked the final end of institutional continuity with the Holy Roman Empire, though cultural and legal continuities would persist. The North German Confederation established by Prussia in 1867 represented a new model of federal organization that combined democratic legitimacy with effective central authority. The Confederation's constitution provided for a powerful chancellor responsible to the Federal Council, while preserving significant autonomy for member states. This system would provide the framework for German unification under Prussian leadership. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 created the opportunity for the final unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. The proclamation of the German Empire at Versailles in January 1871 was carefully staged to evoke memories of imperial greatness while establishing Prussia's hegemony over the new state. William I's reluctant acceptance of the imperial title reflected his understanding that the new empire was fundamentally different from its medieval predecessor. The German Empire that emerged from unification was the most powerful state in Europe, combining industrial efficiency with military prowess in ways that would reshape the continental balance of power. Yet this new empire also carried forward many traditions from its Holy Roman predecessor. The federal structure of the Reich preserved the autonomy of member states while creating effective central institutions. The legal system combined Roman law traditions with Germanic customs in ways that reflected centuries of imperial development. The cultural revival that accompanied political unification drew heavily on imperial imagery and symbolism. Richard Wagner's operas, particularly his Ring cycle, reimagined Germanic mythology and medieval history for modern audiences. The Nibelungenlied and other epic poems from the imperial period were republished and studied as expressions of German national character. Medieval castles along the Rhine were restored as symbols of German cultural continuity. The academic study of imperial history flourished during the late 19th century as German scholars worked to understand their nation's complex past. The Monumenta Germaniae Historica project, begun in 1826, made available scholarly editions of medieval chronicles, laws, and documents that had previously been accessible only to specialists. Universities throughout Germany established chairs in medieval history and Germanic law. Legal historians trace the development of constitutional principles from the Golden Bull of 1356 to the modern federal system. The concept of subsidiarity, which allocated governmental functions to the most local level capable of effective action, was recognized as a fundamental principle of both imperial and modern German governance. The tradition of constitutional limitation on monarchical power provided precedents for parliamentary development. The relationship between church and state in the new German Empire reflected both continuities and breaks with imperial tradition. The Kulturkampf of the 1870s, Bismarck's conflict with the Catholic Church, echoed medieval struggles between emperors and popes while reflecting modern concerns about national unity and religious diversity. The eventual reconciliation between the German state and the Catholic Church drew on imperial precedents for accommodation and compromise. Protestant churches in Germany had been shaped by centuries of imperial constitutional development. The principle of territorial churches, established during the Reformation, had created a decentralized religious structure that paralleled the empire's political organization. The Prussian Union of 1817, which merged Lutheran and Reformed churches, represented an attempt to overcome religious divisions that had plagued the empire since the 16th century. The economic miracle that accompanied German unification built on foundations laid during the imperial period. The guild system, which had regulated urban production throughout the empire's history, was gradually replaced by modern industrial organization. Yet many industrial cities maintained traditions of civic independence and commercial cooperation that recalled their medieval origins as imperial free cities. The Zollvereins's expansion into a German common market fulfilled dreams of economic unity that had inspired imperial reformers for centuries. The standardization of currency, weights, and measures eliminated barriers to trade that had fragmented the empire's economy. The construction of a German railway network created the infrastructure necessary for industrial development, while facilitating the cultural integration that made political unity possible. The rise of German nationalism during the 19th century was deeply influenced by romantic interpretations of imperial history. The Brothers Grimm's fairy tales preserved folk memories of medieval emperors and knights while adapting them for modern audiences. Historical novels by authors like Gustav Freytag romanticized the medieval period as a time of heroism and cultural flowering. The Germania monument erected near Detmold in 1875 symbolized this romantic nationalism. The enormous statue of Arminius, the Germanic chieftain who had defeated Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest, represented German resistance to foreign domination while evoking memories of the empire's medieval greatness. Similar monuments throughout Germany celebrated both ancient heroes and medieval emperors as precursors of modern German unity. The architectural revival that accompanied political unification drew heavily on imperial precedents. The reconstruction of Cologne Cathedral, begun in 1248 but left unfinished during the medieval period, was completed in 1880 as a symbol of German cultural achievement. Neo-Gothic churches and public buildings throughout Germany evoked the empire's medieval heritage while serving modern purposes. Heidelberg Castle, ruined during the 17th century, was partially restored as a symbol of German Romantic nationalism. The castle's combination of medieval and Renaissance architecture represented the continuity of German cultural development from the imperial period to the modern era. Tourist guides emphasized the castle's connections to imperial history while adapting medieval spaces for modern visitors. The Wagner festivals at Bayreuth, beginning in 1876, created a new form of cultural nationalism that drew heavily on imperial themes. Wagner's operas reimagined Germanic mythology and medieval history as expressions of eternal German values. The festival theatre, designed specifically for Wagner's works, created a ritual space where modern Germans could experience their nation's mythologized past. The Ring of the Nibelung, Wagner's massive tetralogy, transformed medieval Germanic legends into a modern cultural phenomenon. The opera's themes of heroism, betrayal, and redemption resonated with audiences who saw parallels between mythical conflicts and contemporary political struggles. Wagner's combination of ancient Germanic paganism with Christian symbolism reflected the complex religious heritage of the Holy Roman Empire. Educational reforms during the imperial period emphasized the study of German history and culture. The gymnasium system, which prepared students for university study, required extensive study of Latin and German literature that included medieval imperial sources. Students read Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, the Nibelungen Lied, and other imperial texts as part of their cultural education. Universities throughout Germany established research institutes dedicated to medieval studies. The study of imperial law became a specialized field that attracted scholars from across Europe. The Max Planck Institute for European Legal History, founded in Frankfurt, became a center for research into the constitutional traditions that had shaped modern European government. The influence of imperial constitutional principles extended far beyond Germany. The federal system of the United States, established in 1787, drew on both English and German precedents for the division of sovereignty between central and local authorities. American political theorists like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton studied imperial history as they designed institutions for the new republic. The Habsburg monarchy, excluded from German unification after 1866, continued to embody many imperial traditions in its governance of Central and Eastern Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 created a dual monarchy that balanced competing national claims while maintaining dynastic unity. This system drew on centuries of imperial experience in managing diverse populations and conflicting loyalties. The First World War marked a watershed in European history that ended many institutional continuities with the imperial past. The collapse of the Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Ottoman empires in 1918 eliminated the last multinational monarchies that had preserved medieval constitutional traditions. The creation of new nation-states based on ethnic principles represented a fundamental break with the empire's inclusive political culture. Yet even the republican governments that emerged from the war's aftermath drew on imperial precedents. The Weimar Constitution of 1919 created a federal system that balanced central authority with state autonomy in ways that recalled imperial constitutional development. The Basic Law of 1949, which established the Federal Republic of Germany, explicitly acknowledged its debt to historical German constitutional traditions. The European Union, established in the 1950s, represents the most ambitious attempt to recreate the empire's vision of unity in diversity. The EU's federal structure, its balance of national and supranational authority, and its commitment to subsidiarity all echo principles that were central to imperial governance. The Union's motto, "United in diversity," could serve equally well as a description of the Holy Roman Empire's fundamental character. The peaceful integration of former enemies within European institutions fulfills dreams of Christian unity that had inspired imperial rulers from Charlemagne to Charles V. The elimination of internal borders within the European Union recalls the freedom of movement that had characterized the empire at its height. The euro currency represents the most successful attempt to create a common monetary system since the empire's medieval coinage reforms. Modern Germany's federal structure preserves many features of imperial constitutional development. The Bundesrat, which represents state governments in federal legislation, recalls the imperial diet's role in medieval governance. The Constitutional Court's authority to resolve disputes between federal and state authorities continues traditions of judicial review that had developed during the empire's final centuries. The principle of subsidiarity, which allocates governmental functions to the most local level capable of effective action, was explicitly incorporated into European Union law, partly because of its central role in imperial constitutional theory. This principle, which had enabled the empire to govern diverse populations across vast territories, provides a model for contemporary efforts to balance efficiency with democracy in complex political systems. Religious freedom and minority rights, which had become central features of imperial governance after the Peace of Westphalia, influenced the development of modern human rights law. The empire's experience in managing religious diversity provided precedents for contemporary efforts to protect minority communities while maintaining social cohesion. The principle of religious tolerance, hard-won through centuries of conflict, remains a cornerstone of democratic governance. Cultural institutions throughout Europe continue to preserve and interpret the empire's complex legacy. Museums in Vienna, Prague, and other former imperial cities display artifacts that represent 1,000 years of European history. The Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg houses one of the world's largest collections of imperial art and artifacts, while the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna preserves treasures from the empire's final centuries. Academic conferences and scholarly publications continue to explore new aspects of imperial history. Recent scholarship has emphasized the empire's role in promoting trade, preserving classical learning, and developing legal principles that influence modern constitutional development. Environmental historians have begun to study the empire's relationship with the natural world, while gender historians have examined the roles of women in imperial politics and culture. Archaeological excavations continue to reveal new evidence about daily life in the empire. Excavations at Charlemagne's palace in Aachen have provided detailed information about Carolingian court culture, while discoveries in small towns throughout Germany have illuminated the lives of ordinary people who lived under imperial authority. These findings help balance traditional political and military narratives with social and cultural history. The digital age has created new opportunities for studying and preserving imperial history. Online databases make medieval manuscripts and documents accessible to scholars worldwide, while virtual reality technologies allow visitors to experience reconstructed medieval environments. The internet has facilitated international collaboration among historians and has made imperial history accessible to popular audiences. Popular culture continues to draw inspiration from imperial themes and personalities. Historical fiction set in the medieval empire attracts readers who are fascinated by the period's combination of political complexity and cultural richness. Television series and films about medieval life often feature imperial characters and settings, though historical accuracy sometimes suffers in the pursuit of entertainment value. The empire's influence on language development remains visible throughout German-speaking Europe. Many legal and administrative terms that originated during the imperial period continue to be used in modern governance. The German language itself bears traces of the empire's multilingual character, with vocabulary borrowed from Latin, French, and Slavic languages, reflecting centuries of cultural exchange. Place names throughout Central Europe preserve memories of imperial history. Cities founded by emperors often retain elements of their original names, while geographic features bear names that recall medieval political boundaries. Rivers that served as imperial frontiers, mountains that marked territorial divisions, and valleys that provided routes for imperial armies all carry historical significance that enriches contemporary understanding of European geography. The empire's architectural heritage continues to shape European urban landscapes. Medieval cathedrals and civic buildings provide focal points for modern cities, while restored castles and palaces attract millions of visitors annually. The preservation and interpretation of these structures requires ongoing collaboration between historians, architects, and local communities. Tourism focused on imperial history has become an important economic sector in many regions. The romantic road through Bavaria attracts visitors interested in medieval architecture and culture, while Rhine cruises emphasize the river's role in imperial history. Medieval festivals and historical reenactments provide opportunities for people to experience aspects of imperial culture in contemporary settings. Educational institutions throughout Europe incorporate imperial history into their curricula as part of broader efforts to promote European understanding and integration. School textbooks emphasize the empire's role in creating common cultural foundations that continue to influence European development. Exchange programs allow students to study in different European countries while learning about their shared historical heritage. International organizations continue to grapple with challenges that the empire faced throughout its existence, balancing unity with diversity, managing competing loyalties, and adapting traditional institutions to changing circumstances. The empire's thousand-year experience provides a wealth of examples, both positive and negative, for contemporary political leaders who must navigate similar challenges. The question of imperial legacy remains complex and contested. Critics emphasize the empire's role in suppressing local autonomy and perpetuating social inequality, while defenders stress its contributions to legal development and cultural preservation. Modern scholarship attempts to evaluate imperial achievements and failures within their historical context, while recognizing that different perspectives may lead to different conclusions. Environmental consequences of imperial policies continue to influence European landscapes. Medieval deforestation, agricultural development, and urban growth patterns established during the imperial period continue to shape land use throughout Central Europe. Climate historians study imperial chronicles for evidence about medieval weather patterns and their impact on political and social development. The empire's commercial networks helped establish trade patterns that influence contemporary European economic development. Cities that prospered as imperial commercial centers often maintained their economic importance through subsequent historical periods. The Rhine River, which served as a major imperial trade route, remains one of Europe's most important commercial waterways. Legal systems throughout Europe continue to reflect imperial influences. The concept of federal authority balanced with local autonomy has influenced constitutional development in countries far from the empire's original boundaries. International law draws on imperial precedents for managing relations between sovereign entities while maintaining overarching frameworks for cooperation. Diplomatic protocols developed during the imperial period continue to influence international relations. The complex ceremonial requirements that governed imperial courts provided models for later diplomatic practice. The principle of diplomatic immunity, which protected imperial representatives in foreign territories, became a cornerstone of modern international law. The empire's experience in managing religious diversity provides relevant insights for contemporary societies that must accommodate multiple faith traditions. The gradual development of religious tolerance through centuries of conflict and accommodation offers lessons for modern efforts to promote interfaith dialogue and cooperation. The principle of religious freedom, established through imperial constitutional development, remains central to democratic governance. Scientific and intellectual developments during the imperial period laid foundations for later European achievements. Imperial courts patronized scholars and artists whose work contributed to the Renaissance and scientific revolution. The preservation of classical texts in imperial libraries and monasteries ensured that ancient knowledge remained available for later generations of scholars. Musical traditions that developed during the imperial period continue to influence European culture. Medieval liturgical music, court songs, and folk traditions that emerged in imperial territories provided foundations for later musical development. Composers from Bach to Wagner drew inspiration from imperial themes and historical events. Culinary traditions throughout Central Europe preserve imperial influences. Regional cuisines that developed during the medieval period continue to reflect the cultural diversity that characterized imperial territories. Winemaking traditions along the Rhine and Danube, beer brewing techniques that spread throughout German territories, and agricultural practices that were standardized during imperial periods all contribute to contemporary European food culture. The empire's linguistic legacy extends beyond vocabulary to include fundamental concepts about governance, law, and social organization. Terms like Kaiser and Czar, derived from Caesar, spread throughout Europe and beyond as symbols of imperial authority. Legal concepts developed during the imperial period continue to influence jurisprudence in many legal systems. Genealogical research has revealed the extent to which European noble families trace their ancestry to imperial institutions. Many contemporary European families, both noble and common, can trace their lineage to individuals who served in imperial administration or benefited from imperial policies. These family histories provide personal connections to imperial legacy that transcend academic historical study. archaeological evidence continues to reveal new aspects of imperial material culture. Recent excavations have provided detailed information about imperial coinage, trade networks, and technological development. Analysis of imperial artifacts using modern scientific techniques has revealed information about diet, health, and living conditions that was not available to earlier historians. The empire's influence on urban planning remains visible throughout Europe. Medieval city centers that developed under imperial authority often retain their original layout and architectural character. Urban planning principles that emphasize the relationship between religious, commercial, and governmental institutions continue to influence contemporary urban development. Conservation efforts to preserve imperial cultural heritage require ongoing international cooperation. UNESCO World Heritage Sites that include imperial artifacts and architecture receive protection under international agreements that reflect contemporary recognition of the empire's historical significance. These conservation efforts ensure that future generations will be able to study and appreciate imperial cultural achievements. The complex relationship between imperial history and modern national identities continues to influence European politics. Countries that were once part of the empire must balance acknowledgement of this historical connection with assertion of their contemporary sovereignty and cultural distinctiveness. This balance requires careful attention to historical accuracy while respecting contemporary political sensitivities. Regional identities within modern European states often reflect imperial territorial boundaries and cultural divisions. Bavaria's distinctive character within Germany, Alsace's unique position between France and Germany, and Bohemia's complex relationship with both German and Czech culture all reflect imperial historical influences that persist despite subsequent political changes. The empire's federal structure provided precedents for contemporary efforts to address regional autonomy within larger political units. Scotland's relationship with the United Kingdom, Catalonia's position within Spain, and similar regional autonomy movements often invoke historical precedents that include imperial constitutional arrangements. International scholarly collaboration on imperial history reflects the European Union's success in creating frameworks for peaceful cooperation among former enemies. German, French, Italian, and other European scholars now work together on research projects that examine imperial history from multiple national perspectives. This collaboration produces more nuanced and comprehensive understanding than would be possible through purely national historical scholarship. The digitization of imperial historical sources has created unprecedented opportunities for comparative historical research. Scholars can now examine documents from across the empire's vast territories without the expense and time required for extensive travel. This technological development has democratized access to imperial historical sources, while facilitating new forms of historical analysis. Contemporary political movements sometimes invoke imperial imagery and symbolism to support their agendas, though historical accuracy is often sacrificed for political effect. Extreme right-wing groups may romanticize imperial history while ignoring its complexity and contradictions, while European federalists may emphasize imperial precedents for unity while downplaying historical conflicts and failures. The empire's experience with migration and cultural exchange provides relevant insights for contemporary European societies. Medieval imperial territories experienced significant population movements as people sought economic opportunities, fled persecution, or followed military campaigns. The integration of these diverse populations required flexible approaches to governance that contemporary policymakers continue to study. Economic historians continue to analyze imperial commercial networks and their influence on European economic development. The emergence of capitalism in Europe was shaped partly by commercial practices and legal frameworks that developed during the imperial period. Banking techniques, commercial law, and trade financing methods that originated in imperial territories influenced later economic development throughout Europe. environmental historians examine imperial agricultural and forestry practices for insights into sustainable land management. Medieval agricultural techniques that were developed in imperial territories often emphasized long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. These practices provide models for contemporary efforts to balance economic development with environmental protection. The empire's multicultural character provides precedents for contemporary efforts to promote cultural diversity within unified political structures. Imperial policies that protected minority languages, religious practices, and cultural traditions while maintaining overall political unity offer insights for modern societies that face similar challenges. Gender historians have begun to examine women's roles in imperial politics and society more systematically. Empresses like Theophanu and Kunigunde exercised significant political authority, while women in noble and merchant families played important roles in maintaining social and economic networks. These historical examples provide precedents for women's political participation that were often overlooked in earlier historical scholarship. The empire's educational institutions, particularly its cathedral schools and universities, provided foundations for European intellectual development. Teaching methods, curriculum design, and institutional structures that were developed in imperial educational settings influenced later educational development throughout Europe. Contemporary educational reforms sometimes draw on imperial precedents for organizing learning communities. Military historians continue to study imperial warfare for insights into tactical and strategic development. The evolution of cavalry tactics, siege warfare, and logistical organization during the imperial period influenced military development throughout Europe. Contemporary military institutions sometimes study imperial campaigns for lessons about leadership, organization, and strategic planning. The empire's artistic heritage continues to influence European cultural development. Imperial patronage of artists, architects, and craftsmen produced works that remain among Europe's greatest cultural treasures. Contemporary artists often draw inspiration from imperial artistic traditions while adapting them for modern audiences and purposes. The study of imperial history contributes to broader understanding of how large, diverse political entities can maintain unity and effectiveness over long periods. Contemporary international organizations, federal states, and multinational corporations face challenges similar to those that imperial administrators addressed throughout the empire's thousand-year existence. The peaceful dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 provides a model for how historical institutions can end gracefully when they no longer serve contemporary needs. Francis II's decision to abdicate rather than fight a destructive civil war demonstrated wisdom and restraint that contemporary political leaders might emulate when facing similar transitions. The empire's legacy of constitutional government, religious tolerance, cultural diversity, and federal organization continues to influence political development throughout Europe and beyond. While the specific institutions that governed the empire for 1,000 years have long since disappeared, the principles and precedents they established continue to shape human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. In quiet libraries where scholars study medieval manuscripts, in courtrooms where judges apply legal principles developed over centuries, in parliaments where legislators balance competing interests and values, in churches where diverse communities worship together, and in homes where families preserve traditions passed down through generations, the influence of the Holy Roman Empire continues. The empire may have ended, but its legacy lives on in the institutions, ideas, and ideals that continue to guide human societies in their eternal quest for justice, prosperity, and peace.